I'm very excited to be joined today by Coleman Hughes, who is a writer, a podcaster, and as I recently learned, a musician. Welcome to Bad Faith, Coleman.
It's great to be here.
So, Coleman, I think the way most people know you as is probably because you are one of a relatively small number of Black conservatives.
Mhm.
And the Black conservative occupies this weird space in the American imagination. Like all Black people who don't vote for Democrat, and this is vote for Democrats, and this is something that I obviously have experienced. There is something akin to a revulsion that is often directed to us, I think, because we have been a part of one of the most consistently loyal demographic groups for the Democratic Party. So much so that when Black people don't vote Democrat, there is the implication that we ain't Black in the parlance of the President of the United States of America. Of course, there's a difference between the valence of my reasons for not being in the Democratic Party and your reasons for not being in the Democratic Party and being a Republican are somewhat different. So just by way of introduction, I wondered if you could talk to me a little bit about how you came to your politics.
Yeah, so for starters, I politically I'm an independent. I've only voted twice for president, and I voted both times for Hillary and for Biden for Democrats, mainly because I did not like Trump.
Oh, fascinating. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so I'm not actually a Republican. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. And a lot of my views on race and racial inequality would be categorized as conservative. So in that sense, I accept that label. But yeah, I didn't really come to politics by thinking about it as liberal versus conservative. I came to it from a philosophy background mainly, and so basically I was a person that didn't really care very much about race or didn't think very much about race growing up. I grew up in a very diverse liberal suburb of New York, and I had friends of every race, but I mainly connected to people on the basis of our shared interests, like music or anything like that. And then I got to Columbia University, and suddenly, every week in the student newspaper, someone was writing about how they experienced racism on campus, in one of the most progressive, subcultures that exists on Earth. And there was this general, new to me, kind of hysteria and hyperventilation about white supremacy, which felt very strange to me because it didn't capture my reality, it didn't capture what I was seeing day to day. And I became very curious. Why is it that people are hyperventilating about white supremacy and racism in a way that seems to me to be irrational and unconnected from reality? That's when I became really curious, and I applied my my brain and my love of philosophy, and I started reading voraciously people like Glenn Lowry, who has been on this podcast, who is a hero of mine, John McWhorter and others, and found that the explanations that they gave about race and racial inequality from many of these people are Black conservatives. Thomas Sowell, probably the greatest Black conservative writer of the 20th century. Their general viewpoints on the matter appealed to me much more than what I was being told from most of Black liberal writers, progressive writers, and certainly most other professors, writers, and elites on campus.
What about their writings appealed to you?
It seemed more connected to reality. It seemed to accept the basic fact of how much progress has been made in reducing racism in this country. Well, if I talk to my grandfather about what it was like to grow up during Jim Crow, he's astounded at the life that I'm able to lead. I remember a couple months ago, he visited me and he saw me at a table, just like socializing effortlessly with white people. And he comes up to me after and he goes, "It's amazing to me that's just so easy for you, because you just didn't, growing up, you could not cross the color line in my day." And so when I hear the way that racism is talked about in America on the left right now, you could go for a pretty long time without hearing anyone acknowledge that more than a little progress has been made, that a lot of progress has been made. The way you hear people talk, you'll see op-eds saying, Black people have to fear for their lives every day. If you're jogging while Black, you have to look over your shoulder. I mean, this stuff I think it's deeply unconnected from reality. And what resonated with me more about McWhorter and Lowry is that they seem to have a pretty empirical approach to actually looking at how much racism exists in society. They seem to be constrained by reason. And I think that ultimately led to conclusions that are considered to be not mainstream, pretty fringe, in the Black community and on the left in general.
So, I mean, there was a time when I probably would have been kind of admittedly triggered by what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reflecting on why it is that I have a lot more sympathy for your approach than I did in yesteryear. I won't say that I, agree with it entirely, and we'll get into why, but I remember, I mean, on one hand, when I was in college, 15 years ago plus, I remember there being an emphasis on race and racial politics that was, I don't think, entirely manufactured. There were these incidents, right? There were like real concrete incidences of racism that you could point to. Black kids playing sports on the public lawn of the university had the cops called on. These kinds of things were happening, empirically happening on campus. At the same time, with some distance and kind of viewing the trajectory of racial discourse from that point until now, it's easier to identify areas in which there has been an overreach, not in characterizing, I think, some of the systemic problems that are very important, but in overemphasizing some of the kind of individual instances of racism and taking those instances as representative of racial progress or where our focus should be on in a general striving for equality. So the Harvard kids had the cops called on them on Harvard's campus becomes emblematic in a way that erases, I think, more important struggles. And it's not to diminish that, but that's like the headline news, right? Meanwhile, the kind of economic precarity that so many people are living in, the material issues that people across the racial spectrum, concentrated among Black and brown people, but across the racial spectrum, feel got broadly ignored. And that's how we got some of the racial tensions that eventually brought us to Trump, because there was this shift where we switched from feeling like the underdog. I think some of the hyperbole came from feeling like it was so difficult to get racial issues heard at a certain point in time through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, to have like broad, wide cultural acceptance. Then all of a sudden we were winning. Obama was president, and that hyperbole didn't back off, such that people who were not from historically marginalized groups, but who were still struggling a great deal, looked around and said, what are all these people complaining about? Why should I care that some affluent person of color got, the cops called? Why do I care if Oprah was denied being able to buy a $40,000 purse at a store? I can't afford groceries. And then you got this resentment that set in. And part of my project as a writer has been trying to figure out what is sincere and genuine and something we should be fighting for, and what is kind of a rhetorical overreach that's basically making the left look bad. And so I wrote about cultural appropriation and how I felt like that I kind of jumped the shark in some respects. And I wrote about identity politics in the political context, and that's how I kind of got my start. But I think that where we do differ, I think, is on some of those more substantive issues. And you raised this question about, how far have we come? And I think that you're right, that sometimes the discourse can obscure that there's a big difference between my life and my dad, who was the first graduate from an integrated high school in Virginia, a first class to graduate from an integrated high school from Virginia. At the same time, I think the frustration from some on the left, the broad left, is that the fact of progress is sometimes used to quiet conversations about inequities that still exist and what should be done next. And I wonder what you think about that critique.
Yeah, so I mean, first, to go back to your first point, this is one of the things that has always struck me as deeply wrong as a Black kid that grew up with a lot of economic privilege. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a big house. I grew up in a nice neighborhood. And I also I grew up in a nice neighborhood that also was very racially diverse.
Hmm.
So it wasn't a nice neighborhood where only white people had money, in other words. My next door neighbors were also black, had an even bigger house. So um, I remember at Columbia, there was this guy who was a white kid, and he's from a very, very poor background. And there's so many dynamics where it struck me as so interesting that I would see privileged black kids sort of wielding their identity in a conversation as a kind of trump card, which you could do in this subculture, to someone that objectively came from a lot less privilege than they did, but happened to be, as my dad would say, like a central casting white guy. And this always struck me as very cynical and or very, let's say, toxic, something that should be called out, but people were afraid to call out because the skin color is what you can see. And if you're in a subculture where your skin color can, in some way, give you this elevated victim status, which is actually sort of praiseworthy, and you can use as an element of social power. I saw a lot of that happening. And I do think that those resentments, that anecdote is like a kind of parable for the resentment that some Trump voters feel, especially those Trump voters who voted for Obama twice, in those storied places like Macomb County, Michigan, and so forth. And so, yeah, that's always struck me as something that a lot of Black people who come from privilege dishonestly fall into this kind of way of attaining social power, which is to play up the extent to which one has been harmed on the basis of racism. And like, this is what, this is not to say I've experienced no racist incidents in my life. Right. I have. They have been very few and far between. They've been extremely frustrating when they do happen, but very, very few and far between. As for your, as for this idea of, can progress lead to this attitude that, well, listen, America's the best place on earth. So many people want to come here of all races and backgrounds, and the left isn't acknowledging that. So does that lead to this kind of complacency? Yeah. Can it? I think no doubt it can. And I think elements of the right, there's a lot of, I think there's a strain on the American right, and probably the right in every place on earth, that says basically things are exactly fine the way they are right now. Mm-hmm. We don't need to change a thing, and every change is necessarily bad. And there's even a strain of conservative philosophy, which really, in principle, emphasizes not changing things, on the idea that there are more ways to mess up society than there are to get it right. And that if our society is surviving, it means whatever traditions we have are at least not terrible, and that we should change them at our own peril. Even if the new ideas sound good, we should have a presumption against them. That's actually, like if you read Roger Scruton or any other conservative philosophers, that's the explanation that they will give. It's sort of like chaos theory. Like, there are more ways to build a table wrong than there are to build it right. And if you got a working table, don't just switch things around. Maybe there's a wisdom to the fact that it's been sturdy for thousands of years or whatever.
But working for whom? Sturdy for whom, I think, is the question that so many people on the left ask. Because there is obviously a status quo bias for people who are advantaged by the current system. But the nature of wealth distribution and political power distribution obviously overwhelmingly benefits the affluent, and increasingly a smaller and smaller sliver of the affluent. And that seems to be one of the biggest things that kind of a left movement that is, I think, also very critical of the way identity has been weaponized and used to divide up working class people and maintain political control among elites. That is the biggest hurdle to overcome, because there was a lot of legitimate fear about changing the system. I mean, what did they say? capitalism is the worst system ever invented, except for all the other alternatives. That's a
Mm-hmm.
line conservatives like to use.
Yeah.
And so people, I think Steven Pinker comes to mind. There are these people who, when you bring up ongoing inequities, whether racial or class or of any kind, they'll often say, well, look what the global poverty rates come down so much. It's at historical lows.
Mm-hmm.
There are fewer hungry people in the world than there have ever been.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that sometimes leftists or liberals fall into the trap of trying to argue that. And I don't think you have to argue it. You just say, yeah, that is true. And also, there are 2 point however million Yemeni children under the age of 5 who are threatened with starvation right now. I mean, both things can be true. What is the point of you in announcing the progress in the context of trying to address ongoing harm? So I do think it's a little bit like, when are you bringing that stuff up?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So
yeah.
One answer to that, the point of bringing those things up in response to people who are concerned about inequities and inequalities is because, well, the implication is the system you want to tear down might be the reason partly for all this progress, right? Mm-hmm. You wanting to defund the police, for example, I don't mean you, I mean, abstractly.
No, I do.
Okay, so here's an example. Mm-hmm. Person A says, let's get rid of the police. Let's disband it. Let's defund it. Look at all of the inequalities and who the police is arresting, all of, all the abuses, etc. So let's get rid of the whole thing. The reason a person, or greatly diminish it, whatever. The reason a person like Pinker might at that point cite, his book on the decline of violence is because his thesis is that having police is the reason for the hundreds-year-long decline in the murder rate in Europe. It's the reason why the murder rate is lower than it's ever been, and that's why he cites the progress, because it's like this idea. I think Chesterton's fence is like what it's sometimes called. It's like when there's a fence somewhere and you have no idea why it's there, before you take it down, you should ask, because it could be that there's some threat that it's been gone so long that you don't even know how society solved it to begin with. And if you get rid of the fence, all of a sudden, so figure out why the fence is there, figure out why the police are there by looking at what happens, like in Montreal when there's a police riot, or when the police go away, look at what happens. And then you see, oh, okay, well, we do need the police. We need them to be there. We need to improve them. But we can't just tear down every system that yields an inequality, because those systems might be the fountain of a lot of progress that is unacknowledged.
Well, I think with all due respect, the issue is, for people who have been studying police abolition for decades, there's not a mystery as to why the fence is there. And in fact, the reasons for erecting the fence, the specific populations that the fence was literally designed to control and corral, are part of why the system is seen to be so structurally flawed, so fundamentally flawed, that it needs more than the kinds of revisions that we have been trying in good faith for decades now with no resolution. And so it does sometimes feel, as the person on the left, like these issues are treated with a kind of a flippancy and a superficiality by people like Pinker, who have not treated the issue area with the seriousness that I think it deserves, and respect the research that people have been doing for decades, looking for solutions that don't sound as radical as defund the police. Because I think there's an acknowledgement that that's a difficult political sell, and people have kind of been pushed to this point as we've been playing with the idea of reforms since at least the 80s. And the defund movement isn't abstractly saying, let's tear down the fence because fences are bad. It's saying, well, we've been putting more and more money into the fence, making it higher and higher every year. And there's no correlation between increasing funding to this preventative measure and a decline in crime rates. Quite to the opposite. So Pinker and those types tend to look at broad, generalized global trends. But when you look at these more specific local trends of how much money, 50%, over 50% of LA's entire city budget is going to the police. So I think the questions has to start to be asked. What's the number that you're going to get the crime rate down if people are concerned with crime? 60% of the budget, 70% of the budget? Should all of the resources and tax dollars of LA citizens go into creating a police state? Or should we start to experiment with other tools to see, well, if other things are correlating with crime, if having after school programs for kids correlates with lower crime rates, if not having lead in drinking water correlates with lower crime rates, if kids having better educational options and options for job placement and growth as an adult, are they less likely to commit crimes? Or is better housing correlated with less crime? Then maybe it starts to be more advantageous to invest in those things instead of continuing to kind of throw money at something that doesn't seem to be working. And I'd say the same for other areas, right? Like throwing money at education, just throwing more money at schools also hasn't shown to have the effect that a lot of liberals wanted. And I similarly think that you have to start to look at some structural issues there as well. So this isn't just me making an ideological pitch, but it strikes me
You're for defund public education. Is that your new slogan?
No, that wouldn't be my new slogan. But
I'm actually making more than a cheap point though, because public education is another area that has been widely seen on both sides to be failing for a pretty long time. And if you were to try to improve it, nobody's first idea, well, not nobody, many people. They
have defunded public education.
Yeah.
They don't call it that, but they do it.
Right. But if you just defunded it, nobody would be surprised if it didn't improve, because often the way to improve something is either to fund better, fund differently, or even fund more so as to attract better workforce. Defund actually it wasn't really an attempt at reform. It was like a jab at the whole. It was an attempt to just hurt and diminish the police force. And you know what I'm saying? It's
so I think there is some of that, and I think that it's a perfectly reasonable emotional response to want to hurt and diminish the police force, especially in the wake of what we all saw with George Floyd. And I think you saw this in the polls, even among white Americans, and how approving they were of the police precinct being burnt down in the wake of that video. Is that when you see something so galling, a lot of folks do want to do more than maybe use the terms that are most pleasant. I mean, they do want to hurt and jab. But I do think that the education and the police example are a little different, because the police ostensibly aren't the net good in of itself. They're there to prevent a bad downstream effect, crime. Education, the school is the resource that we want. It is the mechanism that we put in place to educate people. And if the defund the school movement were a movement to fund some other educational alternative that we, for some reason, wouldn't be calling a school, but would be something else that had better results, I would be very open to whatever that was. But the defunding of the school is more of a every man for himself situation, voucher programs, people taking money out of the public schools and going into private schools, and then basically making, commodifying education in a way that is going to make the educational inequities that already exist, exacerbated.
I hear you. I mean, this is where I'm going to just sound like a conservative. Like in both cases, so like if there were a defund the school movement, but there was some alternative, like you're saying, and some alternative that sounded to me intuitively idealist, like too idealist, like, oh, we're going to get rid of teachers actually, and we're going to have the students create their own curriculums and learn whatever they want at their own pace, and hope that they learn math and all the stuff that is annoying to learn and difficult. And well, that would sound great and whatever, but I think probably there's a reason that the basic structure of how we've been doing it, there's some probably emergent wisdom, even though it's far from imperfect to have kids sitting 6 hours a day looking at a chalkboard. There's probably getting rid of the whole system to some idealized version that assumes like people are perfect and stuff. I would want to try slower changes before going into this system that sounds so great. Obviously, we can get lost in this analogy too deeply.
Well, yeah. I mean, I do think that, again, the defund the police people aren't kind of abstractly thinking about what might work. These are policy tested interventions that have shown to diminish crime in communities. So So, and again, in an education example, if it were the case that despite funding teachers, kids, basically, I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that police officers solve so few crimes, and that the deterrent effect has its limitation. So if there were just like 10 extra teachers that were hired and like put in a room all by themselves, and someone said, just reel it back, or those 10 teachers should be put to work doing something else entirely, the way that the defund people think about police. So police officers, I don't know if you still want to call them that, but people are being hired instead of to troll around in police cars with guns, but to offer social services, to be trained to intervene when there's a mental health crisis, which is there was the cause of so many police calls, instead of being trained so specifically on disarming people, disabling people, shooting people, running them down in their cars, things like that, then you would have the net benefit social effect. Not that there aren't people that need to do the same work. So in your example with the teachers, it was, people homeschooling or self-teaching. That wouldn't be the idea. The idea would be like, okay, well, maybe we should train teachers in a different technique. Maybe we should train people, if you want to call them teachers or what, to be doing something else that is ultimately socially beneficial if we have decided as a society that the social benefit that they're providing currently just isn't there. And again, I would be very open to that if that were the case, and that could be proven.
I interviewed Anthony Barksdale about a year and a half ago. Anthony Barksdale is the deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department for a long time, a jiu-jitsu black belt, and the namesake of the character Avon Barksdale in The Wire. I don't know if you ever saw that show.
Only a few episodes. I couldn't get into it. I'm going to get canceled for this.
Yeah, that's a canceled take. Well, a lot of people in your audience will know who I'm talking about, Avon Barksdale. Anyway, so he is the kind of cop. He is because he has a jiu-jitsu black belt, he has placed a big priority, in his own telling at least, of never going to his gun unless he absolutely needed to. And he often didn't need to because he knew how to control a suspect without hurting them, without hurting himself. That's, basically what jiu-jitsu is all about. And I asked him about the mental illness thing. I said, a lot of people right now, they want to replace cops with trained social workers to respond to mental illness calls as a de-escalation tactic. What do you think of this idea? And he said, more or less, listen, if I hadn't been a cop all my life, if I hadn't answered dozens and dozens and dozens of mental illness calls in my life, it probably seemed like a good idea to me too. But let me tell you a story. One time I answer a call for mental illness. This guy, his mother calls him. I go, everything is going okay. We're going to get him to the hospital. He seems clearly mentally ill, but he's not violent. And he's totally cooperative, and it's very warm. And then all of a sudden, like a switch, I become a dragon to him. And he has to fight me to the death. And now he's trying to kill me and he's wailing on me, just like a light switch. What happens when the first mental illness social worker gets in a situation like that, which will happen pretty quickly? Well, I guess then we're going to give them.
It happens all the time because the people who work with the mentally ill as a profession aren't cops. They're people who work with mentally ill people as a profession, and they're trained to deal with mentally ill people who have psychotic breaks that are often larger than them and more powerful than them. And we don't put guns on everybody in a psychiatric institution.
Well, they have bed straps and tranquilizing liquid. Like this is not, there's no, I'm unaware of a Jedi mind skill that reliably makes someone having a psychotic break calm. Like that's not a skill that necessarily exists.
No, Coleman, but this is how the world is already operating. When our society is functioning, and we certainly don't have nearly enough mental health support. But you're right. There are tools that aren't guns, including, yes, drugs and all other kinds of restraints that help people to manage difficult personalities. And what is the implication of saying that someone has to have a gun to deal with a mentally ill person? I mean, does it concern you at all that the implication is that this is a category of human being that because they are erratic, and most time, I want to just really be clear, not violent, but at times violent in
Why
an
is it,
unpredictable
Briahna,
way.
why is it that the person calling who loves the mentally ill person and knows them more than anyone else in the world, right? Knows the intricacies, if it's your mother, they know your intricacies. They know how to talk you down from an episode better than any quote unquote expert because they've known you their whole life. What do you think has driven her to call the police?
If you're getting at the idea,
probably the fear of violence.
right?
In 9 out of 10 cases.
But Coleman, no one's disputing the idea of violence, and I think this is where people get caught up. The question is whether or not it has to be met with a gun. And I understand that it is easier to shoot someone dead than it is to engage with them physically. But this is the whole problem with the cops and guns. The presumption is that cops shouldn't have to get physical. And I admire this Baltimore police chief for at least having the physical skills and training to have the confidence to engage with human beings in a way using sublethal force. The problem is that we have decided as a society that basically it's okay to use lethal force with people, regardless of whether or not they are in fact using lethal force back. And I think it's a real problem. I think the mother who calls someone in to deal with their child who's having a psychotic episode does not, in fact, want their child to be killed. They want someone who is stronger than them, who there's multiple people perhaps involved, people who have restraints and sedatives, to come and help her resolve the situation, not to shoot her child.
That doesn't sound like a social worker. That sounds like a jujitsu black belt,
No.
But this is
it doesn't have to be a social worker. The point is, Coleman, but let's stay with this.
Yeah.
You can call it whatever you want, but I think we are agreeing that the way to mediate that situation requires some strength. It requires perhaps multiple people. It requires certain kinds of tools. The implication is not that some 25-year-old fresh out of a master's program with a clipboard and a pen can resolve every situation. And I think it's important that we're talking about this because I think that is what's in so many people's imaginations when we're talking about defund the police and fund social work. No,
but it's interesting that this solution that you're advocating would require essentially cops without guns and with excellent martial arts and verbal mediation skills,
well,
which is great.
That. I would call. I think that the people who work right now in these institutions.
What do you call someone that is allowed to initiate force without them being considered breaking the law? That's a police officer. Because if I'm just a person, then I can't. You know what I'm saying?
People in mental health facilities. First of all, I don't know about initiating force. The whole point of the call, I presume, is because this person. The person having episode.
Oh, right, but like
being disruptive. If I take engage with force,
if I take them to the hospital, it's kidnapping, right? I have to be a cop in order for that to be an okay thing to do, essentially, or somehow licensed by the state, right?
Yeah,
to
like
be
psychiatric facilitators are licensed by the state. There's various codes that are escaping my mind right now, where you're allowed to restrain people at least on a temporary basis before it's looked over by the courts. In their own health interests. That is something that people who are mental health practitioners are licensed to do. It doesn't always have to come down to cops. So, I mean, this is the point. That
but there's nothing magical about the category of cop. We were just talking about people that have the government's authority to do certain things that citizens can't.
Exactly. There's nothing magical about the category of cops. So why are we so invested in it only being people in black outfits with guns on and hats on their head to address all these situations? Can't we be more creative about the kinds of skills? Can we be more, not even creative? Can we be more realistic and look around the world and see what actually works? Who has the kind of skills that are needed for the wide variety of situations that come up, that most of which aren't burglar escaping from bank with a bandit, a bandit eye mask on and in a bag of cartoon money,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the issue. And I don't see there's a lot of disagreement between us here on this, actually.
No, I don't think so. But I think Anthony Barstow, one thing he said is he found jujitsu to be so useful in allowing him never to have to go to his gun that he tried to train his department. And again, we're talking about he's the top dog at Baltimore PD, right? If anyone should be able to just get this done, it's him. And he couldn't do it because he wasn't allowed to require cops to learn jujitsu. And he could only offer it as an optional thing, and he couldn't pay them to learn it. And so then you get these cops that have absolutely no skills as a baseline and get terrified and pull the trigger too soon.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree that cops not having confidence or training in their physical skills and the equipment to protect themselves in these situations without feeling like they need to resort to deadly force is a huge problem. It is a huge problem. And obviously, there's going to be some portion of the population that needs to have what is more traditionally understood as a cop. Sometimes there is a bank robber. People need detectives to track down crimes and investigate. And sometimes, you know, lethal force is always going to be necessary. Well, I shouldn't say it's always. We can live in a little bit of utopia in my planet. Hopefully, one day someone will figure something out and we'll get to Star Trek land. But in the near future, it's going to be necessary. And I think it's important to talk about that to help people kind of swallow the idea and open their minds up to rejiggering the way we go about addressing crime. But I didn't mean this to be a whole conversation about defund the police. I wanted to come back to this point about identity politics. We've criticized how kind of liberals have run away with it. But there's this new like pivot that's been happening on the right side of the aisle. And I wanted to get your take on this new anti-white racism ad that you might have seen. We can play it for you really quickly here.
When did racism against white people become okay? Joe Biden put white people last in line for COVID relief funds. Kamala Harris said disaster aid should go to non-white citizens first. Liberal politicians block access to medicine based on skin color. Progressive corporations, airlines, universities all openly discriminate against white Americans. Racism is always wrong. The left's anti-white bigotry must stop. We are all entitled to equal treatment under law. America First Legal paid for this ad.
What do you make of this and some other moves I've seen from Republicans where there's a lot of stressing of identity and diversity? The RNC was more diverse than the DNC in 2020, and they championed that and celebrated that, seemingly acknowledging what they kind of never really wanted to acknowledge when liberals were saying that diversity was a net good. What do you make of these kind of moves combined with an ad like this that characterizes? Well, let me just ask you first before I weigh in. What do you make of an ad like this?
I think half of those grievances were true, half of them were sensationalized. It is true that Biden put white men last in the restaurant revitalization fund, but then the courts reversed it, and a lot of people of color and women that had been promised money because they were in the priority group initially, then got it yanked away. The whole thing was an absolute mess and should have been done on a race neutral basis. There was the non-white farmers bill as well, section 1005 of the American Rescue Plan, which put minority farmers, actually just gave no aid to white farmers. But that got struck down by the courts. So it didn't end up, the money wasn't dispensed. Listen, if I were a poor white person, if I were a white guy with like a restaurant that, half these restaurants went under during COVID and I was put at the back of the line with my race, I think I'd be pissed and I'd never forget it. And that kind of ad would really appeal to me. And I think that's something that Democrats really have to watch out for, because those policies are not actually popular, even among the Democratic base, in my opinion. And I don't think most people want that. I think people want need-based stuff, merit-based stuff, especially in emergencies. It really strikes people as wrong to penalize or try to balance the scales of history in some abstract way while penalizing like individuals.
Yeah. It struck me. I mean, one of the worst examples of this, I think, was the way that Biden characterized wanting to pick a Black VP. In the abstract, like not in the abstract, but philosophically, I value diversity. I think that the reason I do, though, the reason that I would say it's important is that the fact of us having had 45 presidents and approximately the same number of vice presidents, and none of them ever having been white or non-white or female in the whole history of the country, where half the country is female and 25% or whatever it is non-white, speaks to the historical barriers that have existed to those groups ever having a shot at the presidency or the vice presidency, and that those doors should be open and the search pool should be inclusive of groups that were previously excluded. But the way that he said it, saying I'm specifically targeting a Black woman and downplaying the kind of qualifications or even the ideological leanings of the candidate pick, I think really set Kamala up and anybody who would have picked up to being dismissed as a non-meritorious candidate. And in the same way, the goal of rectifying historical programs that historically excluded Black people, even intentionally by design or by default, for example, house workers, housekeepers being excluded from New Deal programs, or Black farmers being disadvantaged by some of these kind of programs, or Black people being redlined and things like that. Wanting to make sure that doesn't happen in future programs is obviously a goal, and policy should be designed to prevent those kind of exclusions from happening. Explicitly coming out and saying we're just going to put Black people to the front of the line is explicitly saying this is no longer a merit-based system that's based on economic precarity, but based on race. And unless it's an explicit reparations program, which I would argue is key to kind of a tort law style repayment for specific harms that happen to people, the same way it would be the case if I were in a car accident and it was your fault and you had to pay me. Outside of that, I don't think the government should be dipping and dabbing in that kind of language. It does it itself a disservice, and it sets itself up for exactly these kind of ads.
Yeah.
Now I will say, yeah, go ahead, please.
I agree with everything you just said. I think at the end of the day, people are going to find it very. Well, let me put it this way. I was I don't know if I told you this story last time. I don't think I did, but a couple years ago.
It was on your podcast, so let's pretend it's fresher for these listeners.
Yeah. I think like 2 years ago, I was at dinner with some Ghanaian and Nigerian folks who I knew through my kind of extended family. I'm not Ghanaian or Nigerian, maybe far back, but they're recent immigrants. Mm-hmm. And this is interesting because this connects to the Woman King movie that recently came out with Viola Davis and the African participation in the slave trade. And for some reason, we were talking about this. And as hopefully your listeners know, most of African American slaves were already captured as slaves in Africa by other tribes and then sold to Europeans for goods and so forth. They weren't like captured like to contain most of them. So we were talking about this, and
I mean, I do have to just interject there. I mean, the idea of it being kind of organic, when obviously the huge market for slaves that opened up with millions of people being taken across the Atlantic creates an incentive to capture people and sell them into slavery that far outstripped whatever kind of territorial disputes and slave capturing was going on in Africa and the rest of the world around the time, right? So we can't pretend there's not like when there's suddenly a huge multi-million slave market opens up, that doesn't have an effect on local practices.
Sure. I'm sure it did. At the same time, slavery had been around in, 1,000 years or more.
Of course.
Anyway, so we're talking about this, and I said to them, how are you taught this growing up in Ghana and Nigeria? You were taught that, kingdoms like the Dahomey and Woman King were prolific slave capturers and slave traders and profited. And some of you are actually descendants of those tribes. How do you guys learn about this? Do you learn about it with guilt? Do you learn about it with remorse? Do you learn about it? And they said to me, no, we just learn about it as a neutral fact, just like any other historical fact. And I thought to myself, yes, that is actually how most people experience the crimes committed by their own ancestors, basically as a neutral fact. Most people don't feel guilt. And my working theory is that white people are humans and that they feel the way most humans feel about that stuff. The truth is, most white Americans that either experience being discriminated against in the name of redressing the past or even hear about it, they're not going to react well, because they understand that they personally didn't do those things, and they should not be paying for the sins of their ancestors. That's just a fact.
What do you think the origin of the guilt is? Because I think I agree with you that the guilt aspect of it isn't especially constructive. Mm-hmm. Although I know plenty of Black people, for I think the reasons that we were talking about before, where there's, at least at a certain historical moment that I think is passing, the ability for affluent Black people in particular to get some like credibility and leverage in the social sphere for kind of exploiting that guilt. So I think some of it comes from that. But like me personally, I've never been interested in like there needs to become a public reckoning. That kind of Ta-Nehisi Coates approach of we need to have a public conversation. No thanks. I don't need you to feel guilty. I would like there to be reparations for harms done. But like, I don't have an interest in some 25-year-old from New Jersey, like wearing a hair shirt and self-flagellating. You know what I mean? So where do you know, who's telling white people they have to be guilty? And is there a way to like swap guilt for something more material and useful?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that one, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
So, I mean, the other, I mean, look, I think that it's important to talk about because there was a time when, again, so many of the things and the positions that I'm expressing today, I would have reacted very negatively to because of the politics that I would presume are attached to those sorts of views. And I'm at this point, I'm old enough and I've seen enough and I've experienced how my politics bounce off people, how they react to it. And I'm much more interested in results than a kind of performative, for lack of a better word, virtue signaling that I used to do a lot when I was younger and when I was in college. And I do credit some of the conversations that I've heard and participated in with people like yourself around whom I feel a little less defensive, to be honest, because you are Black and you do come to these conversations with such good faith.
Right.
I want to credit you for that in some degree. The last thing I want to talk to you about before we wrap, though, is, you know, the big figure in the state of Black conservatism right now. I wish it were you and, you know, John McWhorter and Glenn Loury.
Oh yeah.
Unfortunately, it's Candace Owens. What do you make of it? What do you make of the Kanye situation? What's your read?
Oh Lord, it's hard. The whole thing is really hard for me to watch because, you know, I'm a big Kanye fan. I think what he is, the way he's been talking about Jews and the way he's been spreading and directing hate and bigotry at them is really wrong and misguided. I also think in many of his other moods, when he apologizes for the things he said and he clarifies that I actually don't understand him as a bigot. You know, he's this kind of person that can be in one mood one day and explain his frustration with the lawyers and the contracts and the long history of Black artists being screwed over in the record industry in a way that actually makes a lot of sense. And then the next day he's just spouting off about the Jewish media and like, and the implication is always that the reason that the people who are exploiting him is because they are Jewish. Right. He doesn't seem to be able to disaggregate those things and speak truthfully to exploitation that I believe is happening. Right. And this idea that it's somehow rooted in their Jewishness. Right. And obviously, if anyone started talking about Black people this way, right, like identifying a minority that like is a problem, but then casting all Black people as that problem, he would recoil against that instinctively, but he can't see why Jewish people and you know, folks in general would recoil at that, which is a big lack of self-awareness. As for Candace, I've just always felt that there's really something off about her, and I feel that she doesn't really have Kanye's best interests at heart, and I'm stunned by how sort of obsessed with her he is, and I think she's willing to benefit from her association from him when he's on the upswing of a bipolar, but I wonder if she's really there for him when he's on the downswing.
Well, she's gotten largely what she's wanted. The publicity, she got Kanye to buy her husband's company in the interest of Free Speech Parlor. You know, she's getting the bag. She seems to be very savvy, very smart. I think people often underestimate her. Liberals often underestimate her and give her easy wins, easy dumps. We've talked about it in an earlier episode, how she kind of embarrassed, I think it was Ted Lieu at a Senate hearing because he put words in her mouth that didn't exist, and she was able to rightly accuse him of misrepresenting her in a way that ultimately won her the moment.
Right.
And it frustrates me because most liberals kind of write her off. They say Uncle Tom and all the things that Black conservatives are called, without really kind of engaging in the power that she has and the persuasive power that she has and what she represents to a lot of people. And I wonder, I mean, you said that you see her as something off about her. I mean, as a Black conservative, are you and Glenn like sitting around, like putting your heads together, like, God, what do we do with this Candace situation? She's making us all look so bad. I mean, what do you guys make of her?
It's interesting. I haven't talked to John or Glenn about her in a very long time. I'm pretty sure Camille and Thomas Chatterton and I all view her kind of askance. I mean, first of all, her history is super strange. She was like this huge Black progressive, and then like almost literally overnight became the Candace Owens of today in a way that happened so quick as to not be plausible and as to suggest a kind of ulterior motive, financial and status based. That's not to say I disagree with everything she says. She says a lot of things I do agree with. Like when she talks about how horrible it is to have a victim mindset to encourage victimhood, all of that stuff is stuff I feel deeply. At the same time, I've just rarely seen her be like responsive to evidence in a way. I think she just doesn't care what's true. She strikes me as someone that actually doesn't care what's true, that isn't bothered by saying things that turn out to be wrong, which to me is just like a huge red flag as a person. And so she gives me all the wrong vibes. And it is one of those situations where sometimes I think you're harder on the people that are closer to your ideology than the people that are much further away at some level, because truthfully, I hate to be associated with her. I hate that the idea that anyone has ever thought of me and her in the same sentence pains me, because I see myself as such a different kind of person than her fundamentally, even though you could probably get 10-second clips of us saying the same thing. So I do kind of feel that with her.
Yeah, I guess I do want to ask you about this, the victim mindset idea. I don't want to get onto it. We don't have enough time left fully, but I have observed that despite kind of criticizing liberals for having a victim mindset, and again, sometimes, as we discussed, with more affluent people using identity metrics to kind of get clout, does happen sometimes. Also, there are times when people have been victimized, and various groups are subject to discrimination, historical marginalization, just straight up poverty, sexual abuse, all kinds of things. And people, there is a such thing as a victim that we should be, I think, fighting to protect and uplift. But I have observed that despite all of those attacks on liberals as snowflakes and victim mindset and stuff, you do see a trend on the right, or I at least do see a trend on the right, where they're in some ways embracing the power of that. I think that some of this free speech interest is organically about free speech and censorship, but some of it is about being able to stake a claim as the world is out to get me. I'm anti-establishment. I'm on the outside. And certainly I make those arguments too. I am anti-establishment, and I'm currently getting what do you call NAFO attacked on the internet for
I saw that.
talking about Ukraine. So it is what it is. I mean, but like, do you see the conservatives moving in that direction? And ultimately, do you think it's a good thing, a strategic thing, a savvy thing, or is it going to be a trap the same way it was for liberals?
It's a good question. I mean, you can see how much power there is in victimhood and how Trump behaved for 4 years. His ability to paint himself as a victim of the mainstream media, and many of his grievances were true in the respect that he wasn't really treated fairly, but he was also an insane con man. Right. But
both things can be true. The media did not love Donald Trump. The Republican media did not love Donald Trump.
Yeah. Point is, his ability to paint himself as a victim of the establishment gave him power with the people. Yeah. Because, he was, I mean, look at the plot of every Hollywood movie. I mean, we love to see someone that has gone through genuine struggle and been victimized somehow overcome it. And so that's a very powerful aspect of human psychology that people tap into. The danger is when people begin to exaggerate the truth, and for them to develop this perverse and ulterior motive relationship with victimhood, where like they need to be a victim because that's all their power. If they were no longer a victim, they would have no more status in life. And that's when you become incentivized to play up that aspect of your life. And there may be some of that on the right, maybe that you're referring to, with kind of getting censored online. And so, for example, I've seen this. I've seen people in my comments or DMs often telling me that like they haven't been seeing my tweets lately, and like I think you're getting shadow banned and all that stuff. And I've never gone in for that because I think a lot of it is paranoia. Again, I might be wrong.
Well, that's the problem with paranoia. Sometimes the paranoid thought is true.
Yeah.
And I think that's what is so, I mean, I'm someone who does believe that they were shadow banned. And I think that I recently became unshadow banned within the past few days. I mean, my follower number went off a cliff from getting minimum 3,000 new followers a month to going to 0 or negative. And it's been that way for about a year and a half, like a cliff from 1 month to the next.
When did that happen? I've seen someone else post a similar graph like that.
It was about April of last year.
Okay.
Yeah, I think April was the cutoff month.
So that's interesting. So my instinct has always been I don't want to go down this route with myself, because I don't want to. I'd rather be wrong and have been a victim than not have been a victim and go around saying I've been a victim. So I've
isn't that the kind of the trap that the people who could be potentially exploiting you take advantage of the fact that you feel pressured to be silent because you don't want to seem silly. You don't want to get made fun of in case you're wrong. You don't want to seem paranoid. And that, I mean, it's a difficult balance, right? For a long time, I didn't say anything because how can I be sure? But at a certain point, the evidence starts to mount. And now that I'm unblocked, seemingly overnight, it's a very noticeably different feeling. Wow. But who's to say? Maybe just for no reason at all. For 18 months, I didn't pick up a single follower. And
amazing. So
yeah,
was being Bernie Sanders national press secretary was not enough of a credential with whoever's controlling those decisions to be left enough? So for one, and I think this is an interesting lesson that Elon Musk is learning, and I saw John Schwartz tweeted this the other day at The Intercept, that the driving force of censorship and everything that happens on Twitter, it's like superficially political, but it's not like a bunch of libs are sitting up there at Twitter saying, oh yes, this is what the content has to be. It's that they are appealing to advertisers who may or may not be more liberal or basically more moderate, frankly, in their political orientation. They just want to sell Pampers, you know? So what Elon is realizing now is that the real censorship is this top-down censorship, the corporate censorship that basically wants to sanitize everything regardless of political valence. And that's the real battle he's going to have to fight. So the idea that like I'm on the left and so the Twitter people should like me. No. I am not the kind of left that they like. And I was someone who grew my account from like nothing. I was an anonymous person for most of my Twitter growth. And so I have a pattern. Like I know what it looks like and I know what it feels like, because I was a 500 person account in 2016 or 17 or whatever it was. And so I think Elon did say he lifted some kind of something. I've talked to some other people who have seen some changes. And again, it's only been a few days. Who knows if it'll stick or who knows what it is. But yeah, I do think that at a certain point, my tweets got deprioritized. And more than that, I would see, you get the alert, 50 people just followed you, whatever, throughout the day. No matter how many of those alerts I would see. And I used to kind of screen grab them and see if I could keep track. No matter how many of those alerts I see, the total number never budged by more than like a couple of hundred people. Huh. So you're like the rate of people leaving you was the same as them following you, or?
Exactly, precisely for 18 months.
Very strange.
And all of
Very
a sudden,
strange.
but I don't mean to make this about me, kvetching about
No, but this was
Twitter
like
followers.
I've over the past 2 years, I've talked about this shadow banning thing many times, and I always include the caveat that I could just be wrong, and I have gotten shadow banned because I really haven't looked into it on purpose because I'm afraid of what I might find out and how I might sound if I begin to have suspicions.
Well, let's reconvene when the analytics for November come out at the end of the month.
Yeah, exactly.
See if there's real results here. Look, I always enjoy talking to you, Coleman.
Likewise.
For people who haven't listened to our episode that we recorded on your podcast, they should definitely check that out as well. Where can people find you, your work, and your podcast on the internet?
Yes, podcast is called Conversations with Coleman. You can get that wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, etc. You can also go to colemanhughes.org to subscribe to my podcast, get extra content. And you can follow me on Twitter, where I am possibly shadow banned, possibly not, at ColdXman.
All right. Thank you so much, Coleman.
Thanks,
Thank you
Briahna.
to all the listeners as well. Bad Faith, as you know, comes out twice a week if you're a subscriber. We have free Thursday episodes plus premium Monday episodes you can find at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. It's been a wild week where people have been threatening and reporting me to Patreon and trying to get my Patreon pulled. So I just want to take a moment to also just thank all of you who do subscribe and who have supported me and enabled me to be independent, have conversations like these ones, have opinions like the ones that I have about Ukraine, Russia, and do interviews like the ones I did with Joe Sorrencione that got me into so much trouble. So thank you all. And as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.